The story of humanity has been told the same way for centuries. According to the best-known biblical accounts, the first human being was created from the dust of the earth, and from him all generations originated. But what if this version was only part of the truth? What if even before the existence of the first man, there were other beings, as old as the creation of the universe itself? Sacred records hide mysteries that defy human understanding. Among the passages that are rarely mentioned are those that speak of enigmatic figures known as the sons of God. They were there before humanity, before the first breath of life in Eden. But who were they? In ancient texts, there are mentions of a celestial group that witnessed the founding of the world. They were present at the time when the structure of the universe was being shaped. Their voices resounded as light and darkness were separated, as the foundations of the earth were laid. But there is something peculiar about these reports. These beings were not just spectators. His actions, his presence, seem to have played a fundamental role in the construction of reality as we know it. For centuries, many have tried to ignore or downplay these passages. In some versions, the sons of God are simply angels. In others, they are something completely different, something that defies traditional understanding. At times, they appear as beings of glory and light. At others, they are figures who challenged the established order and influenced human history in hidden ways. The question becomes even more intriguing when you realize that these mentions are not isolated events. They appear in different passages, some discrete, others enigmatic. In some texts, they are described as participating in a heavenly council, as those who walk alongside the Creator. In others, they are agents that directly interfered in the destiny of humans, altering the course of history in ways that perhaps have never been fully revealed. Time passed, and these reports were forgotten by many. But the truth does not disappear. Within the pages of Scripture, clues are scattered, waiting to be connected. For those who dare to look beyond the conventional narrative, the veil begins to lift, revealing a much broader picture than what we are typically told. If these beings existed before the first man, then was the creation of humanity really the starting point? Or have we been inserted into a bigger plan, which was already underway long before us? This mystery deepens as we analyze the descriptions left in scriptures and ancient texts that expand the scope of the story of creation. To understand who the sons of God really were, it is necessary to observe the clues left over the centuries. Some of this evidence points to a truth that has been obscured, perhaps deliberately. Others indicate that this knowledge was once an essential part of ancient traditions, but ended up relegated to a secondary position in the modern understanding of spirituality. The scriptures tell us that they were there in the beginning, celebrating the creation of the world, but soon after records emerge that some went astray, altering the established order. Some remained faithful to the Creator, while others took paths that challenged the balance of the cosmos. From this, an inevitable question arises. Did the battle between good and evil begin before humanity even existed? If you like exploring hidden mysteries and discovering forgotten truths, subscribe to the channel to follow more content like this. Here, we go beyond what is taught, connecting clues and revelations that challenge the conventional view of history. Don't miss the next discoveries. Turn on notifications. If the story of creation is deeper than we imagine, what else could be hidden? What has been forgotten over time? What do these figures represent within the structure of existence? Answering these questions requires careful analysis of sacred texts and the tradition that accompanies them. Between the words are fragments of a larger story, a story that can completely change the way we understand our own role in existence. Ancient mysteries have always sparked fascination and curiosity, especially when it comes to knowledge that appears to have been hidden over time. The history of humanity is full of fragments of truths that have been erased, distorted, or simply ignored. Many of these mysteries are present in sacred texts that over the centuries have undergone translations, revisions, and interpretations that have shaped the way we understand them today. But what if there was more than what we were taught? What if certain secrets were hidden between the lines of creation itself? When we analyze the scriptures more carefully, we find mentions of beings that existed before humanity, celestial figures described as the sons of God. But why are these passages rarely addressed? In many traditions, these accounts are considered symbolic, metaphorical, or even irrelevant. However, there is evidence that, in ancient times, these references were taken very seriously and were part of the knowledge transmitted by the civilizations that preceded us. During the Middle Ages, for example, the interpretation of biblical texts was tightly controlled by religious institutions. Ancient manuscripts, such as the Book of Enoch, were rejected and banned from official versions of the Bible, remaining accessible only to a few scholars and theologians. This book, discovered in fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls, contains detailed descriptions of a class of beings who interacted directly with humans and who may be linked to the identity of the sons of God. In the Book of Enoch, there are reports of angels known as the Watchers who descended to earth and shared forbidden knowledge with men. Among this knowledge were metallurgy, astrology, and practices that, according to the text, should not have been revealed to humanity. These revelations altered the course of history, leading to an imbalance that resulted in a great divine judgment. The biblical flood, described in Genesis, could be directly related to this transgression, suggesting that the corruption caused by contact between the children of God and humans led to the need for a total renewal of creation. Ancient traditions are not the only sources that talk about occult knowledge linked to these beings. In different cultures, there are myths that describe entities that taught skills to the first people. In Sumerian myths, for example, figures like Enki are portrayed as beings who possessed wisdom beyond human understanding and who passed this knowledge on to mortals. Some of these stories have direct parallels to biblical narratives, which raises the question, do all these traditions talk about the same events, seen from different cultural perspectives? Another intriguing aspect is that, in several ancient societies, certain knowledge was kept restricted to specific groups. Priests, scribes, and mystery school initiates were the only ones who could access this information, while the general population received only basic teachings. This model has been repeated throughout history and may explain why some biblical passages are so brief and enigmatic when they mention the sons of God. Perhaps these reports were better understood in a context in which people had more knowledge about these beings, but over time, this understanding was lost. The very structure of the Bible reflects this process of hiding and selecting information. In the first centuries of Christianity, several councils decided which books would be part of the official canon. The Council of Nicaea, held in the year 325, was one of the events that shaped the Bible as we know it today. During this period, texts that presented divergent interpretations or that could raise questions were discarded. This does not mean that these texts were false, but rather that they did not fit the narrative that the religious leaders of the time wanted to establish. When we look at these decisions in light of the issue of the children of God, we realize that their mention in the Bible is brief but significant. In Job, they appear as spectators of creation. In Genesis, they interact directly with humans. In Psalms, they are compared to heavenly beings. If these fragments were pieced together and expanded upon with apocryphal texts and ancient writings from other cultures, perhaps we would have a clearer picture of who they really were. The existence of hidden truths is not uncommon in history. Much scientific, philosophical, and religious knowledge took centuries to be accepted. The heliocentric theory, which states that the Earth revolves around the Sun, was long rejected because it challenged the established view. Likewise, some archaeological discoveries that contradict traditional narratives are ignored or discredited. If some knowledge about the children of God has been lost or suppressed, the question arises, why? What would this information reveal if it were widely known? Could they change the way we understand the origin of humanity and our role in creation? History shows us that what is considered a mystery today can become an accepted truth tomorrow. The evidence is scattered across ancient texts, forgotten traditions, and clues left over the centuries. It is up to each person to decide whether they are willing to look beyond the surface and seek answers that, for too long, have remained hidden. Since the earliest reports, the existence of opposing forces has been a constant in the history of humanity. The duality between light and darkness, order and chaos, obedience and rebellion, is a concept present not only in sacred scriptures, but also in different cultures and philosophical traditions. At the center of this spiritual battle, we find the children of God, enigmatic beings who, according to the scriptures, were present before humanity and played a fundamental role in the balance of the universe. References to these beings suggest that, in the beginning, they were aligned with divine purposes. However, something has changed. At certain times, the harmony was broken, and some of them deviated from the original path. This rupture generated consequences that shaped the spiritual history of the world and had a direct impact on humanity. Within Judeo-Christian thought, the existence of evil is not an accident, but the result of choices made by beings with free will. Contrary to what many imagine, the concept of an opponent to God does not appear explicitly from the beginning of the scriptures, but is gradually constructed throughout the sacred texts. In the earliest records, we see that certain sons of God were part of the heavenly council, meeting before the Creator. However, some passages suggest that an event of rebellion occurred, altering the established order. One of the most striking examples of this division occurs in the book of Isaiah, which describes the fall of a heavenly being who wished to elevate himself above the Creator. This figure, associated with the Christian tradition as Lucifer, is interpreted as one of the main responsible for the fragmentation of the divine order. In Ezekiel, there is another account of a being who, before the fall, held a prominent position in the spiritual realm. If this interpretation is correct, the children of God who remained loyal continued to act within the divine plans, while those who rebelled began to work against the structure of creation. This dispute between celestial forces can be observed in several biblical narratives, where there is a constant struggle between those who follow the divine order and those who try to corrupt it. The fragmentation of this balance was not restricted to the spiritual world. In Genesis, there is a critical moment when the sons of God interact with humanity directly. The text mentions that they took wives from among the daughters of men, an act that resulted in severe consequences. According to some interpretations, this union between spiritual and human beings brought a hybrid generation into the world, associated with moral and spiritual corruption. The Book of Enoch expands this narrative, describing that these beings taught humans forbidden knowledge, and that because of this, they were punished. This rebellion within the spiritual sphere would have had a profound impact on human history, leading to catastrophic events that altered the course of creation. The idea of an invisible war between spiritual forces also appears in other biblical texts. In the book of Daniel, there is a passage where an angel mentions that he was stopped by an entity known as the Prince of Persia. This conflict indicates that certain forces exert influence on the destinies of nations and peoples, acting behind the scenes of reality. In the New Testament, this concept is expanded. In several passages, there is mention of a struggle not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities that rule in the heavenly regions. These descriptions reinforce the idea that the battle between good and evil occurs on a much deeper level than the simple opposition between individuals and earthly empires. If this spiritual battle predates the creation of man and continues to this day, what does this mean for humanity? Throughout history, many sacred texts indicate that human beings are not just observers of this contest, but active participants, influenced by forces operating beyond ordinary vision. The scriptures suggest that every choice made by human beings reflects, in some way, this struggle between light and darkness. The concept of free will, present since the creation accounts, indicates that humanity was placed in a position of responsibility, being able to choose between following the divine order or moving away from it. The presence of these opposing forces does not mean that evil has absolute power. In several biblical passages, there is the promise that justice will prevail and that order will be restored. However, the existence of this duality reinforces the idea that the spiritual path is not just an individual journey, but part of a larger context in which decisions and actions have implications that go beyond what can be seen on the material plane. The story of the children of God leads us to question the extent to which we understand the true nature of reality. If there are spiritual forces constantly at work, shaping the direction of history, then what does this mean for the destiny of humanity? This confrontation between order and rebellion, between creation and destruction, may be one of the greatest enigmas of existence. Over the centuries, religious traditions have been shaped by interpretations, councils, and decisions that defined which texts should be preserved and which ended up forgotten or relegated to the field of apocryphal scriptures. However, before the formal structures of religion were established, accounts of creation and celestial beings were passed down from generation to generation, forming a complex network of beliefs that spanned cultures and historical periods. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, the sons of God appear at different times, but always in an enigmatic way. In the Old Testament, they are mentioned as beings who witnessed the founding of the world, interacted with humanity, and, on some occasions, defied divine order. However, to better understand its nature, it is necessary to analyze texts that were excluded from the biblical canon, but which have direct links with traditional accounts. Among the most fascinating writings is the Book of Enoch, a text widely accepted in early Jewish communities, but ultimately left out of the Hebrew and Christian Bibles. This book, found in its most complete form in Ethiopia and partially preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls, presents a detailed narrative about a group of angels called the Watchers, who descended to Earth and interacted directly with humans. Unlike the brief descriptions found in Genesis, where the sons of God are mentioned succinctly, the Book of Enoch expands this story, revealing details about the nature of these beings and the impact of their actions on creation. According to this text, the Watchers taught advanced knowledge to humanity, including astronomy, metallurgy, and spiritual practices. However, in doing so, they broke the rules imposed by the Creator, triggering a harsh judgment. The punishment of the Watchers became one of the most impactful events within the apocryphal tradition, as it symbolizes not only the corruption of spiritual beings, but also the transmission of knowledge that altered the destiny of humanity. The influence of this account can be seen in several passages in the New Testament. In the book of Jude, there is a direct reference to the book of Enoch, where it is mentioned that certain angels were imprisoned for their rebellion and await the final judgment. This connection suggests that, even after its exclusion from the official canon, the contents of this book continued to be considered relevant within the early Christian tradition. Another important document is the Book of Jubilees, a text that offers a detailed version of biblical history, including a more in-depth explanation of the sons of God. According to this account, the rebellion of these beings had direct consequences on the development of humanity, influencing events that led to the flood and the need for a new alliance between God and men. In addition to Jewish texts, there are other records that connect to this tradition. In Mesopotamian culture, we find stories that talk about celestial beings who came down to earth and transmitted knowledge to humanity. Sumerian records mention figures such as the Apkallu, described as wise men sent by the gods to guide the first kings. Although these narratives belong to a different mythology, the similarity to the Old Testament sons of God raises questions about the origin of these traditions and whether they share a common basis. In early Christianity, some currents also developed their own interpretations about these beings. The Gnostics, for example, believed that the creation of the material world involved not only God, but also intermediary entities that played crucial roles in shaping reality. For some aspects of Gnosticism, certain sons of God could be related to these beings who participated in the creative process, but who eventually became agents of conflict in the spiritual universe. The fact that so many cultures have similar accounts of celestial beings interacting with humanity suggests that this idea did not arise in isolation within Judaism or Christianity. These texts and traditions indicate that, in ancient times, there was a broader understanding of the presence of these beings and their impact on the physical world. Despite their historical importance, many of these texts were left aside or considered heretical as Christian doctrine was consolidated. The Council of Laodicea, held in the 4th century, and other assemblies that defined the biblical canon helped establish which books would be officially accepted. Texts such as the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees were gradually excluded, remaining only in a few specific traditions, such as the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. This selection process has profoundly influenced the way we understand the children of God today. Knowledge that was once transmitted as an essential part of religious traditions ended up becoming fragmented, accessible only to those who search beyond conventional scriptures. However, traces of this history are still present, waiting to be rediscovered and understood. Since the oldest records, there have been reports of encounters between spiritual beings and humans. In different cultures and traditions, there are mentions of figures who interacted directly with humanity, influencing its development, transmitting knowledge, and, in some cases, challenging the established order. In the Judeo-Christian context, these interactions are described in an enigmatic way and are often surrounded by mystery. Among the most enigmatic characters in these narratives are the children of God, mentioned in texts that suggest a deep and transformative contact with humanity. In the book of Genesis, there is a passage that has raised questions for centuries. The text mentions that the sons of God took the daughters of men for themselves, generating a lineage known as the Nephilim. This event, described briefly, raises a series of doubts. Who were these beings? Why was this union considered a transgression? And what were the consequences of this contact? The Book of Enoch offers a more detailed explanation of this episode, describing a group of angels called the Watchers who descended to earth and were united with human women. From this union, beings of great strength and knowledge were born, but they also brought imbalance to the world. The transgression was not just limited to this physical union. The Watchers taught humanity advanced skills, including the use of metals, the art of war, and the manipulation of spiritual knowledge. The impact of these revelations was so profound that, according to the text, the Creator decided to intervene, triggering a great judgment against these beings. The theme of interaction between spiritual entities and humans is not restricted to this episode alone. In several parts of the Bible, there are records of figures who seem to have characteristics that go beyond human understanding. In some passages of the Old Testament, we find beings described as divine messengers who appear in physical form, interacting directly with men. Some are identified as angels, while others take on a form that suggests an even more mysterious presence. The Book of Daniel contains one of the most intriguing accounts of this contact. During a period of prayer and fasting, Daniel receives a visit from a celestial being who gives him messages about future events. The curious detail of this passage is that the angel mentions that he was slowed down by another spiritual entity, called the Prince of Persia, and that he needed the help of Michael, one of the archangels, to proceed. This episode suggests that there is a hierarchical structure between these entities and that they influence human events in ways that are not fully understood. In the New Testament, there are several interactions between spiritual beings and human beings. The conception of Jesus is a striking example of a supernatural event that altered the course of history. Mary receives a visit from the angel Gabriel, who announces the coming of the one who would change humanity forever. This meeting is described as a moment of deep connection between the divine and terrestrial worlds, reinforcing the idea that these interactions are not mere metaphors, but part of a greater plan. Throughout history, there have been countless reports of spiritual contacts that marked entire civilizations. In Jewish tradition, prophets often reported visions and encounters with celestial beings. In other cultures, mythological figures are described as messengers of the gods who imparted knowledge and guidance to humanity. The big question that arises is, do these interactions continue to happen? If there were moments in history when spiritual beings manifested themselves directly, does this still happen today? Reports of spiritual experiences, visions, and unexplained events continue to be recorded in different parts of the world, leading many to believe that this communication has never completely ceased. The scriptures indicate that humanity has always been inserted in a greater reality where invisible forces act constantly. Contact between humans and these beings may have been more evident in the past, but that does not mean that it has ceased to exist. If there is something that these stories demonstrate, it is that the presence of these beings was never an isolated event, but rather a recurring element within the human trajectory. Ancient records suggest that the story of creation goes far beyond what we know. The sons of God, mentioned cryptically in Scripture, appear to have played a fundamental role in the structure of existence, influencing both the spiritual world and humanity. Their actions triggered changes that echoed through time, shaping beliefs, traditions, and human destiny itself. If these beings were present before humanity and interacted with it in ways that defy our understanding, what else could be hidden between the lines of what has been passed down to us? Lost knowledge, forgotten truths, and unrevealed mysteries may be the key to understanding our true origin. History has never been static. It transforms as new discoveries emerge. If there is anything to learn from these reports, it is that the past still holds secrets waiting to be revealed. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so we can continue to bring you more research and in-depth analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps the channel grow and produce even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support. If you've come this far, it's because you like exploring mysteries and questioning what we've always been taught. This is just the beginning of a journey full of discoveries, and there is much more to be explored. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos, and turn on notifications to stay up to date with each new content. Your likes and comments are essential for this investigation to continue and for us to bring you even more intriguing facts. And if you want to delve even deeper into topics like this, don't leave now. The next video will expand this vision even further and bring new connections that you may have never considered before. Click and continue exploring. See you there.